This is the Comics Alternative Eurocomics. Reviews of McCay and Bearstooth. Bonjour, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Eurocomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Pascal, and we're two guys with advanced degrees talking about comics in translation.
That's right. And on the December episode, we're going to be looking at two really fascinating and kind of interesting, to say the least, titles. We're going to begin with McCay, written by Thierry Smolderen, with art by Jean-Philippe Bramanti. And then after that, we're going to look at Bearstooth, 3 volumes of that, by Yann and Alain Henriet. And the volumes are Max, Hanna, and Werner. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Eurocomics is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but occasionally you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
Yes, and if you look for this month under Titan Comics, the publisher of McCay, they have an oversized special edition of Skydoll, which is one of those sci-fi Italian books by Barbucci and Canepa. It was a huge success in Europe. It's only $27.99, so 30% off on that one. A huge, beautiful hardcover book. And for our friends at Cinebook, DCB service will provides access to Bearstooth Volume 3, also 30% off. That's only $8.37 for one graphic novel. That's a pretty good deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. And we will talk about Volume 3 of Bearstooth in a little bit.
Yes.
But go to dcbservice.com because they will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs, whether you read comics in translation or otherwise. dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Exactly.
So Pascal, now this is our second show to come out in December because our November show was a little late, as we pointed out. So it was just the way it is. And we promised we would be back on time for the December show. So here you go. Earlier we discussed Piero and the adaptation of Camus' The First Man, and now we're here to talk about 2 new titles in translation.
Exactly. Both kind of historical, but couldn't be more different.
That's right. So let's go ahead and jump into this discussion, and we're going to start with Thierry Smolderen and Jean-Philippe Bramanti's McCay, and this is published by Titan Comics. I think it's their Static Press imprint, and this came out, according to Amazon, on November 20th. It may have been out in comic shops earlier, I'm not sure. And the title refers to the actual historical figure, famous comics legend, Windsor McCay. Although this is not a biography, and this is not, I guess, what you would call a straight out or straight-laced historical account of things that were going on with McCay, because one of the things that Smolderen does, the writer, is that he takes the life of Windsor McCay and many of the facts that defined his existence, right? So it's historical to a point, but he infuses it with quite a bit of the fantastic.
You could say that. Yeah, it's almost like trying a way to find a way to understand Little Nemo through McCay's life and the people he met or may have met in real life, and kind of going in strange trajectories from there. And it's kind of I think for Smolderen, this is kind of a huge project he's been working for years, and it was originally published in, I think, 3 volumes in France over a long period of time, but now we have it in one gorgeous hardcover.
Yes.
So it's quite the tome.
Yeah, it is. And now, what do you know of Smolderen's work? How familiar are you with his writings, comics and otherwise?
Well, it's kind of interesting because my first exposure to his work was a very mainstream series, manga influenced, that came out in the 90s in France and was quite a hit, called Gypsy. And it was kind of a post-apocalyptic action, kind of like Mad Max. And he was working with Enrico Marini, who is a huge artist from Italy. He was the first guy who brought the kind of the manga influence through Otomo to French comics. But I didn't know at the time that he's actually a colleague. He's a scholar of comics and quite accomplished as well. So it's later that I found out about his work and that he was teaching in different schools, I think at Angoulême, right? And close to Gorstein and all those guys. So kind of an interesting person. And this book is quite different from anything I've read from him. It's a lot more ambitious. It's very documented, and definitely a lot more literary than the genre stuff I read before.
Particularly Gypsy, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, I was looking up Smolderen and saw Gypsy. Now, I'm not familiar with that, so but the name does definitely ring a bell. And I actually do have a copy of a critical work that he authored, The Origins of Comics from William Hogarth to Windsor McCay, speaking of McCay.
Yeah.
And that came out from University Press of Mississippi in 2014. And Mississippi sent me a copy. I intended to read it, but just never got around, didn't have the time to get to it. And I hate that that's the case. But, he has a couple of other books that are going to be coming out. It's like all of a sudden we're inundated with Thierry Smolderen coming out from IDW. I know that this month, in fact, it may already be out, he's got to work with Alexandra Clarice, Atomic Empire, that again is IDW. And then in the spring, I think it's in April, he has another work with Clarice, Diabolical Summer, also coming out from IDW.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with these. They're probably more recent publications.
There may be. He also has something with Lion Forge, that series Ghost Money, and I think that the collected Ghost Money came out around the summer. So this is so this is someone that I was aware of, but really haven't taken the time to read. Although I am right now, after reading McCay, very interested in Atomic Empire and Diabolical Summer.
Yeah, he's definitely an interesting voice.
Now, we were talking about Smolderen writing within, I guess, a grasp of the historical figure of Windsor McCay, but that's not the only historical figure that populates this text. We also have Charles Hinton, who is, an actual historical British mathematician who explored or theorized about the fourth dimension.
Yes.
So he also becomes a very significant figure in this book. Now, if you were going to describe the premise of McCay to the uninitiated, and by the way, I know this is going to be difficult, but I'm going to ask you nonetheless. I mean, how would you describe what Smolderen is doing in this work?
In a way, I would say it is the birth of the birth of McCay as a comic book artist, but through an event, it's almost like you said. I mean, it's almost like an initiation or something that happened to him that changed his life perspective and seemed to have led to the creation of Little Nemo. Mm-hmm. I don't want to spoil things, but there is also an aspect of the book. It's like the book is mixing several genres. Some of it is historical fiction. Some of it is more like a little fantastical. I don't want to say sci-fi, but
well, there is something kind of sci-fi-ish about this narrative,
but actually close to. And it's interesting because in French we call the Twilight Zone, the series, it's called The Fourth Dimension. It's a French title, La Quatrième Dimension. So when I was reading this, thinking in French, they would probably use that, which for French readers would, connect to the Rod Serling TV show, which actually some of the things happening in there could happen on that episode of The Twilight Zone.
A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind.
Excellent.
Yeah. So, and that's interesting. I didn't know that the French referred to the series, The Twilight Zone, as the fourth dimension, but that does make sense.
And then part of the book is almost like a film noir. I felt kind of there was, especially the visuals, I think, reinforced this. And when I was reading this, there's a big section where, especially with his relationship with, is it Hinton's daughter? Is that right? Let me get.
Alicia.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's Hinton's sister-in-law.
Sister-in-law, sorry. Mm-hmm. And then there's a big sequence there that actually the colors and the artwork reminded me of something out of a Brubaker book, like Jean-Philippe's or Michael Lark, the Gotham Central artist. I had this vibe right reading it. Plus, it's it takes place. What is it? Early 20th century, but
right, yeah.
It is this
the tail end of the 19th, and the beginning of the 20th.
Yeah, the deambulations in the streets and the chases. There's this vibe as well in one part of the book, and again it gets quite surreal.
It does. And, it's interesting that you mentioned the noir quality to this. I felt it, although it's interesting. I didn't think of Brubaker and Phillips, although I can definitely see some Phillip-esque, not intentional references, but the art is not completely dissimilar, right?
Yeah, the use of blacks and things. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. But I tell you one thing that I did think about as I was reading McCay, and that is Carol Reeds's film, The Third Man.
Okay, yeah.
Because, and not so much in terms of, I guess, the matters that you were pointing out, the art style, obviously, because, Third Man is a film, but I was thinking in terms of the situation, right? So there's something about one of the characters, who's named Silas, that in a way I thought is maybe a little bit like Harry Lime, someone who is elusive, who is causing problems, and then McCay, in a way, is like the Joseph Cotton character. I think his name was Holly, who it's been a long time since I've seen The Third Man.
Me too.
who is trying to find and even thwart, in The Third Man, Harry Lime, or in this case, McCay trying to thwart what Silas, who is causing havoc from the fourth dimension, is attempting to do.
Yeah, and maybe we should say that Silas is actually, so Silas is a pen name that has been used by McCay on some of his earlier work.
Right, the Welsh rarebit, yeah. The fiend of the...
And it seems Smolderen is playing with that concept, and it is not clear if the Silas is an actual historical figure or he was created for the purpose of the story. I don't know how you felt about that.
I have no clue if he were a historical figure. I mean, I knew that, of course, McCay and then Hinton were, but I don't know about other figures in this narrative. One of the things that I wanted to come back to is a point that you made a second ago in describing the premise, in that in some ways this is a fantastical tale about how Windsor McCay came up with Little Nemo, the comic. Toward the beginning of the book, and this is not giving anything away because you see this in the opening section, or at least close to the beginning, we see Windsor McCay, and this is the tail end of the 19th century. He is working as an artist for, I guess it's kind of a carnival, isn't it?
Kind of a vaudeville.
Place. And so he's just starting to make a name for himself very young. He meets the aforementioned Silas, but he is visited by someone who knows Charles Hinton and says that Hinton is wanting someone like McCay, or specifically wanting McCay, to illustrate a book that he's working on about the fourth dimension. And he feels that McCay, given his aesthetics, would be able to do it. And so one night, McCay and his friend, I can't remember, it starts with a G.
I can't remember.
He's also an artist. But anyway, they go to Charles Hinton's house and they have dinner. And of course, they have Welsh rarebit. And then at one point, McCay's friend gets a little ill or sick from eating the rarebit. And so he goes to throw up. And while Hinton and his wife are making sure that, this guy's okay, McCay goes into, I guess it's the study or in a room where Hinton has this hand that he had referred to earlier. And it's, how to describe it? It's I guess it's a sculpture of a hand, and I can't remember if it's a right or a left hand, but Hinton says something about in the fourth dimension, the left becomes the right and then vice versa. Your left eye kind of migrates over to become your left eye. It's like you're confronting yourself in the mirror. And so McCay picks up this hand, and then something freaky happens to him, and we don't know exactly sure what, or at least I wasn't sure what happened to him. It's quite disorienting, and it's very much, in terms of being disorienting, like the ride that Silas at this carnival space has, which kind of turns the world upside down.
Yeah.
And so when McCay picks up this hand, it's kind of strange because all of a sudden, and we don't have page numbers here, but so I can't refer to it specifically, but when he does so at Hinton's, there's an outline of a figure. It's a little boy who says, "Oh, please don't go. Don't leave me alone." And something weird happens where McCay seems to not faint, but he falls down and he's going through some kind of weird experience on the, he's down on the floor. And then Hinton comes in and finds him and says, just keep moving. You can get through this. We don't know what that means. So we don't know what's happened to Windsor McCay, the character. We don't know what moving forward and keeping going is all about. We don't even know exactly what McCay experiences when he sees this outline of a boy. But because it is a boy, as you point out, we can probably put two and two together to link it to Little Nemo.
And then, and the rest of the book is basically trying to understand and come to terms with what happened in that moment.
Which McCay wants to forget because it makes him ill, literally.
But a lot of different forces and characters are kind of pushing him back to that moment. But it is, on an initial read, and it's a book that may need to be reread because the first time through, it is very disorienting. And it's exactly what the characters are going through, like you said, in the ride, and then in at that moment where we don't know if it's food poisoning or some strange interdimensional travel. And I have to say that the book is visually stunning, and there are a lot of places in the story where the artwork is supporting that sense of mystery and confusion. One scene that comes to mind. So this is another. This is when McCay goes to the Met. He wants to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York to look at art and get some inspiration. And he meets Professor Hinton in the museum, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's this long scene where they are walking through the museum and talking about especially Egyptian art and the way the sculptures are structured, and noticing that a lot of the figures have two left hands or two right hands, which, according to Hinton, is a sign that they were also onto this fourth dimension idea. And then there's a particular page where the characters, McCay is actually walking on the ceiling. You notice that?
When he's at the museum, you mean?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And again, I wish we had page numbers because I remember recalling. I think I found it. Yeah, he's talking with Hinton, or Hinton. He comes to the museum and meets up with him. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, he's walking on the ceiling. It's like, what the hell's going on?
Exactly, and there's no mention of it except, the characters just continue talking, and he's actually at this point where they're talking about Silas, and the fact that it was a pseudonym, but it's also another person. But it's a very interesting page, and actually what happened when I was reading the book, I stopped reading, and I accidentally took the book backwards, and if you actually flip it over, you can actually read it the other way. It's a very odd thing. I don't know, if you turn your book around, then McCay is situated correctly, and everybody else is on the roof. It's reversed, like a mirror experience. It's very odd. And when I took the page, I didn't realize that, and I thought, oh, all the balloons are reversed. What's going on? I didn't realize my book was upside down. But I think this is one point where he's playing with the form. There's a lot of meta stuff going on in that book. Between the creation of Slumberland and McCay's world and what's happening supposedly in his life, what we see in the book.
Right. And there's not only the meta stuff going on with the form, as you point out, turning your book upside down and the creators playing around with that, but there's also a little meta sprinkled in terms of the references. Now, we've mentioned Little Nemo. Now, Little Nemo began as a character, I guess, a year later after appearing in Dream of the Welsh Rarebit, or the Rarebit Fiend. And now it's interesting. I used to work at a restaurant in New York at a cafe, and we had Welsh Rarebit, and at times people called it Rarebit, at times Rabbit. I don't know if both are acceptable, but I've been calling it Welsh Rarebit. But for those who may not know, because Windsor McCay is primarily known, of course, for Little Nemo. But an earlier strip where Nemo originally appeared, that began in 1904, Dream of the Rarebit Fiend, it would always be, or at least the ones that I've read, someone who has some kind of weird, strange experience like a nightmare and then blames it on Rarebit, Welsh Rarebit. It's like, oops, that didn't sit well with me and it made me have weird dreams. And of course, those who know Little Nemo, they know that it's all about dreaming, where at the very end of each strip, Nemo awakens or someone wakes him up, and whatever weirdness had been going on in that strip, and sometimes it can get quite surreal, fascinating though, it was all a dream. And so dreaming, both of those works, Dream of the Rabbit Fiend and Little Nemo, are referenced in this book. Dreaming especially is important, not only in terms of the actual historical strips from McCay, but in Smolderen's narrative, because after that experience that we referenced earlier, right, going to Hinton's house, picking up that hand, the sculpture of a hand, and then having some kind of strange thing going on with him, we still don't know exactly what it was. He has nightmares afterwards. And the only way for McCay, the character, to deal with these nightmares is to draw them. And so what he draws, we can assume, eventually becomes things like Dream of the Rarebit Fiend and then Little Nemo and Slumberland. Yes,
definitely. And so we've talked a lot about very kind of strange, surreal things. And I wanted to mention that in terms of because there is kind of a historical grounding to this work. And what I found fascinating is to see how McCay in his career was connected to the vaudeville world, all this entertainment of the time that, has kind of disappeared today in this form. So he runs into people like Houdini,
yes,
and they actually they are part of the same show, and I thought that was fascinating because we to look at this is the birth of the medium. This is very close to the birth of the comic strip, just a few years after that, and they were trying to invent basically the place of this medium in the entertainment industry, if I can say so. So it's interesting to see those connections with things that we would not connect at all today. Like a escape artist and a comic book artist. It's like they don't have anything to do together. Maybe not in The Escapist, but that we also reviewed.
That's right.
Way back. But I really I thought that was very interesting to see this back and forth, and how McCay also, with his work, animating pictures with Gertie, the dinosaur, and things like this, was actually putting on a show, like as part of a vaudeville act, where he was talking to the audience and presenting his cartoons, his animated work. So all these parts I think is very fascinating, and he also, of course, intersects with Hearst, Randolph Hearst, who was a huge figure in supporting comic strips, and even has a encounter with George Herriman of Crazy Cat fame. So all this stuff is fascinating in the way Smolderen plays with that. I think is very smart.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's one of the things that makes reading McCay such an interesting experience. I mean, not only as we were discussing, the surreal and mind-bending nature of this, the Twilight-esque-ness, if you will, of this book, but also the various historical references like Hearst, McCay, and of course Hinton and
Herriman.
Herriman, yeah.
And then the other aspect is because the Silas character is connected to I guess the kind of a far left anarchist group. So there's this whole backstory as well in what was happening in the social upheavals and things like this during the time, which is also very interesting. So it provides another aspect to it. So it's a very complex book. I mean, there's a lot of things going on. But I think it pulls it off. I mean, it's not. I think it calls for another, maybe a couple of reads because it's very dense. I guess, but I think it will appeal to different kinds of reader. Like if you are into more historical things, you're going to learn a lot. If you are more into the history of comics or comic strips, I think it's very valuable. If you are into noir films, there's a noir vibe. So there's a lot going on for anyone. Yeah,
exactly. And I'm glad that you mentioned that this book warrants more than one reading. I mean, I feel that I need to read it again in order to let it seep in a little more so that I can understand what's going on. Because, as you know, we've mentioned here and there are parts of this narrative that are actually a little ambiguous, and
Completely,
we don't know
yes.
exactly what's going on. Like, for instance, that scene that I briefly mentioned, or I can't even talk today, the scene that I briefly mentioned earlier when McCay first meets Silas, and then Silas invites him to be or to experience this swing that he has that tends to freak people out. And there are 2 pages when this happens that McCay is in this swing, and it's as if the various images in the various panels go topsy-turvy. You know, sometimes they're askew, sometimes they're upside down, sometimes they're right side up, and you don't really know what's going on. And it's not until later, like 2 or 3 pages afterwards, that we learn that the experience that people have in Silas's swing is nothing more than an illusion.
Yeah. The whole room is meant to move around them, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And later on in the story, McCay actually goes through a similar experience, but it seems to be actually happening to him, where he is in going through buildings that have no up or down. It's almost like a Escher drawing, right?
Right, yeah.
And the perspectives are completely surreal, and it's and you're not sure if there are dream sequences or not. It's very, very odd and very interesting. Yeah.
This is a quite fascinating narrative. As I mentioned, it warrants a second reading.
Definitely. I was wondering, actually, would you consider this as a text for a class?
Huh.
Like if you were to teach something about McCay?
That's interesting. Okay, if I were teaching something about McCay, or let's say comics history, right, as opposed to a more aesthetically oriented course, perhaps. And I say perhaps not to kind of short this book on quality and teachability. It's just that there are a lot of things that I would like to teach. And so where would this be on my list? You know, would it be high up in the middle or kind of more down the list? So I don't know. But I think it would be interesting to teach a text like this on a variety of levels. You know, one, to link this to comics history. At the same time, I think that Smolderen is doing something really interesting when it comes to the blending of the historical and the fantastical. And having one of the things you and I were talking about before we turned on the mics is that even though both of us are very much aware of Windsor McCay, neither of us feel that we're up on the details of his history to really fully understand what Smolderen is doing in this text. So this calls for more study into McCay.
Yeah, definitely. I was actually thinking about, Tisserand's book about George Harriman that came out last year. Crazy.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
A wonderful biography. And I was thinking, if I had read a book like this about McCay before reading this, maybe I would get it more, something more fact-based, and see how he's playing with the references. But there's something very playful and kind of reproducing McCay's surreal approach, but applied to his life. So definitely a great book, and actually it's very beautiful. It makes a perfect Christmas gift, right?
That's right. Yeah, and this is album sized, hardbound, beautiful art, as you were pointing out. So definitely get this book. And in fact, I can tell our listeners how they can get this. If they go to comicsalternative.com/book, Amazon, and then they click on our Amazon banner, it'll take them right to Amazon. They can do a search for McCay and Smolderen, get the book that way. And by going through our Amazon Associates account, you'll throw a few cents our way. So 'tis the season to help us out.
Exactly. Please do.
How's that for a plug?
Excellent.
Okay, you want to move on to the second title that we're going to be looking at on this episode?
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is interesting. The series is called Bear's Tooth, and it comes out from, and is coming out from Cinebook. We haven't talked about a Cinebook title in a while. And it's written by Yann, is that how you pronounce his name?
Yes.
Yann, and with art by Alain Henriet.
Yes.
And I wasn't familiar with Yann before Bear's Tooth. Now, I want to ask you about Yann because I know you know more about him. Is it a him, I assume?
Yes, it's a him.
Okay. But Bear's Tooth, what we're going to be talking about are 3 volumes that have been or will be released by Cinebook. Now, the first volume, which is called Max, came out in June of this year. This December, I think it just came out. The first week of December. The second volume, Hanna, it came out. And then in mid-January, although we have a digital review copy that we read ahead of time, the third volume will come out in January, and that is Werner.
Correct.
Okay, so we're going to talk about all 3 of them together, but first, I'm curious to educate me on the work of Yann.
Okay, so this series operates in it's a specific genre of mainstream comics, the comics tradition in France and Belgium, which is historical fiction, and it's a very big genre. And has existed for a long time. It's hard to compare. There's nothing to compare in the States, and this one is a World War II narrative. And there are a lot of them. So the importance of the writer here is Yann has been around for a while. He started his career in the early 80s, and he's traditionally attached to the publisher Dupuis, which come out of Belgium, and they were the ones who published the Spirou journal. So Spirou is this very famous character coming out of Belgium, kind of a rival to Tintin in a way. There was the Tintin journal as well, and they were kind of always at odds, different approach. And Yann is a writer who came out initially as he was raised in that tradition of the Franco-Belgium Spirou type. So a lot of adventure comics for young readers. But when he first started, he was kind of playing with the genres and using irony and a little adult humor that actually put him into trouble when he was very young working in the Spirou journal. And he has this tone, listing stories or types of narrative and twist them with dark humor or using working with artists that had a very kind of cartoony style, but having them tell stories that were very adult. So it was kind of a dissonant when you were reading it. You thought you were reading a book for kids, and suddenly things were taking a strange turn. And he's an extremely prolific writer. There's dozens and dozens of series in every genre, but every time I read one of his books, I know that he's going to be playing with a tradition or a genre of comics that he grew up with and do something different with it. And I have to say, when I read this one, especially the art is very classic, right? It's very classic, very realistic, very detailed, and it really connects with a type of comics from the post-World War II, I would say the 50s, that are focused on a mode of transportation. So in this case, aviation, right? So there were like a series of comics. The most famous is called Bug Danny. There's Dan Cooper. So all these American guys created by Belgian people, right? It's kind of funny. And they're always like fighter pilots. And the stories are, it starts war in the Pacific, and then they invent other things. But they're really focused on having the most exact replica, of planes, and making sure they give us the model names and everything. It's really for plane nerds in a way. Mm-hmm. And we had others that were about cars. So there were stories around cars. And so the ones with planes are often also mixed with historical things, because it's World War II aviation or World War I aviation. So this one is definitely paying homage to those World War II aviation books that came out. Definitely the vibe is there. He's playing with that, but kind of doing his own thing as well. So I don't know how you felt when reading it, but there is also an aspect of the story that's very didactic. Did you feel that?
Actually, I didn't. I didn't get any kind of didactic tone from this narrative. So tell me what you sensed.
Well, it's something I picked up on because it reminded me of the books I read as a kid, where suddenly a character will give you a lot of information about something. And in this story, we have three teenagers who at the beginning of the story, a girl and two boys.
Yeah, Hanna, Max, and Werner.
Yes, who live in Silesia, right? Mm-hmm. Is that the way you pronounce it?
Silesia, I guess. Yeah. Silesia, yeah.
And they are fans of planes. So at the beginning, they're playing with model planes, and they want to get into. They want to actually fly planes or gliders. At that point, is gliders, because we are in the 30s, right? Mm-hmm. And but in their interaction, they provide a lot of information. Historical information about where they live, about the type of planes they like. There's one scene I caught my eye where they are riding bicycles and they're having a discussion. And one of them is Jewish, right? So Max is Jewish. So the Hanna tells him, because you're a Jew, they'll never let you in glider school. And then he says, well, as far as I know, there's no law in Upper Silesia to stop Jews looping the loop up in the clouds. And the way this is written, it's kind of providing information. And another one where he says, my parents say that since the plebiscite of 1921, Silesia can't stay divided between Poles and Germans. So it's like providing historical information like this.
Okay, I see what you're referring to now. See, I wouldn't call that any kind of, like, say, narrative didacticism. I would call it maybe historically exposition heavy, right? So what we have Yann doing here is providing historical context, maybe sometimes in a tad of a heavy-handed way.
Exactly, but I think he's a very experienced writer. I think this is on purpose, because it's really channeling those old comics. That's the way they were.
Okay.
They were meant for kids, but they were meant to teach you something as well. So
yeah,
I just got that vibe from that.
Yeah, I tend to think of didactic narrative as something that is overtly instructional, especially in terms of ethics and morals. More so than, let's say, more objective historical fact. So that's why when you said that you felt a more didactic tone in these 3 volumes, I was a little thrown for a bit, but I see where you're coming from now.
Yeah, maybe the word choice was not the correct one, but what I meant is that you read, it's, Tintin's slogan was getting smarter by having fun, if I translate roughly. So there's this idea of you're going to learn something. So every time you have a plane, there's a footnote. and they tell you this is a small German observation plane used in the Second World War, it is funny because this series came out in France in 2013, the first volume, and it has a very kind of nostalgic thing to it. I think he's playing with that. Like older readers will get that feel from it. So I thought that was kind of a cool feature that he's playing with.
Yeah. It's funny because you mentioning that the French edition, the original edition, came out in 2013 from Dupuis, it caused me to realize, oops, we kind of skipped out on something, and that is talking about the translators of the books for this month.
Oh,
now,
yeah.
The translator of Bear's Tooth, the 3 volumes, is Mark Bentz. And so he's the one who translates Bear's Tooth. And I can't believe I forgot the translator of McCay because it is your predecessor, Edward Gavin.
Yeah, shame on us. Sorry.
Yeah, shame on us. Edward, if you're listening to that, I am sorry that we didn't mention you as the translator of McCay earlier. But hey, we made up for it now by mentioning this.
And it was probably a tough task to translate McCay.
Yeah, I'm sure it was a challenge. But, getting back to something that you were talking about in terms of Yann, his writing in Bear's Tooth, you mentioned the notes. I want to comment on that because, and get your take on it, because there's some notes, as you mentioned, that are more instructional, right? So we get one of the characters, it could be one of the 3 young kids, as kids or as maybe adults, or another character who is making a reference to a particular, let's say, organization, or, and a good example of that is the Luftwaffe, or it could be a particular plane or style. And so there's a little footnote, there's a little asterisk after the name, and then there's a footnote briefly explaining what that is. And I think that that's useful. However, one of the things that Yann and Henriet do is to include, phrases in other languages. Sometimes it's German, sometimes it's Polish, and in the 3rd volume, Russian. And then they translate that, which, I appreciate that. However, I was wondering in reading this, these characters who are German or Pole are already speaking German and Polish. So why are certain phrases in German and why are certain phrases in English, even though these characters, if they're German, are speaking German, but we're reading it as English? And then some of the things that they say are represented in German, but we need translations for that. So that seemed a little off to me. Did it to you?
Yeah, and it is. Once again, this is also a feature of those older books where they would choose certain expressions in a language. So if the characters are American, they, of course, the text is in French, but they would include little expressions, like there were often could be insults or things that they say when they're surprised. I remember there was one keep saying bloody hell or blast or something like this. And they would be, sometimes they had a footnote. They would explain what that was, but they would put it in there to remind you that they don't speak French and to make it a little cooler, I guess. And from the Germans, the German characters, especially World War II stories, this is to create a sense of dread in a way, because often the German characters were, the bad guys in those stories, and so they would kind of show through expressions or language, like the word like schnell, like every French person who lived through the occupation knows the word hurry up, right? Because they heard it. So they would use little things like this. In this one, they used, I don't speak German, sorry, but the word that the Nazis used to refer to the lower races, right?
Oh, yeah.
So they use that one a lot. Every time it has a footnote to And that's the thing, that sometimes the same word is explained many times.
Yeah. And then sometimes not. Yeah, it's strange. It kind of reminds me of something that actually I forgot to mention when we were discussing McCay. And again, we don't have page numbers. It's not quite halfway through, but this is the part of the story where, McCay has kind of made a name for himself. He goes to Detroit, he meets Houdini, and right after that, the Detroit police come in and arrest McCay because they think that he's involved in the death of Hinton. And if you recall, and I'm looking at that page now, the last two panels on this particular page, the police come into his apartment or his hotel room and say, Mr. McCay, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. Anything you say can or will be used against you in a court of law. Okay. This is taking place in 1907. What they are just reciting, I think about word for word, is the Miranda rights. Now, the Miranda rights wasn't made a law until later in the 20th century. And I'm wondering if there's something about the history of Miranda, the Miranda case, that I'm not aware of. So, for instance, maybe there were certain police departments at the time early in the 20th century where police were saying this, right? But maybe not feeling that legally they needed to. Or if this is just a historical snafu on the part of Smolderen.
It could be, because I don't know if he's aware of, maybe he has heard this a lot on TV shows.
Exactly, yeah. So he watches a lot of Law and Order.
Yeah, and maybe Edward was like, this is wrong, but I have to translate it the way it is. I don't know.
Well, it also has me wondering about Edward and what he's doing in terms of his translation, because I don't think, from what I know of, working with Edward on the podcast for quite a while before you stepped up and took over the co-hosting job, I don't know if he would have let this go, but I don't know. So Edward, if you're listening to this, definitely get in touch with us and give us some insight into the Miranda historical issue going on here in McCay. But getting back to Bear's Tooth, the footnotes or the translations or the different languages, it really didn't bother me. It just had me scratching my head a bit. It's like, why are some words in either German, Polish, or Russian, even though we have, let's say, Poles or Germans who are speaking in a language that we can read without being needed to translate?
Yeah, it's kind of a local color issue, or they just want to make it remind us that they are not speaking French or English in this version. Yeah, but yeah. So what did you think about the narrative itself?
I like the story, and I think we can talk a little more openly about the content or the story laid out in the first two volumes. What we find in the third volume, Werner, if we got into too much detail, it would be a spoiler.
Definitely.
Yeah. And so I'll resist the urge to talk about what's going on in the Werner volume, which will be coming out in January. But again, we have an early release copy of this, so we've read it.
Yeah, and I would say, as a reader, you may get a little confused when you're starting the third volume, but things will make sense in the end. Because at one point I was really questions like, what's happening? This doesn't make sense. Because each book, so it's Max, Hanna, and Werner, supposed to be focusing on each character and their journey through the late 30s and until the World War II, until the end of World War II.
Right. And in fact, Volume 3 begins with the tail end of the war when the Soviets have entered Berlin and everything seems lost. Hitler commits suicide. And then the German government and military kind of falls apart. And so, I mean, there's a lot of reference to that. Now, obviously, as we've mentioned their names several times, the protagonists of Bear's Tooth is Max, Werner, and Hanna. The title Bear's Tooth actually refers to something that I think we first start seeing in the second volume and then into the third. At one point when they were kids, teenagers, the three of them, who are very close friends, are climbing this mountain that they probably shouldn't be climbing, especially when it's about to storm. And they go into a cave and they find this bear's skull that they speculate was used as some kind of pagan ritual in some way. And at one point, Hanna, who, as she says several times, is not afraid of anything, smashes the bear's skull, and there are three, are they incisors, I guess? The tooth, one is missing, so there's not four incisors, but there are three. And so after she smashes the skull, she takes the three incisors, and they're quite big, being from a large bear, and she keeps one, gives one to her two companions, Max and Werner, and says, we're close friends. We're never going to part. We'll always be there for one another. And all three of them wear their bear tooths around their neck. And so that's where the title comes from. And it becomes quite important later on, the whole bear's tooth thing. But we see them, in fact, throughout the three volumes, the narrative in ways kind of jumps around back and forth between past and present, not in a confusing way. I mean, there may be no visual or even narrative transition from the past to the present, but you get a pretty good sense of when there is, I guess, what you would call a flashback and what's going on with the three of them, or sometimes the two of them as adults.
Yeah. And in a way, it's also playing with kind of a very, what do I want to say, common trope of the war, people being friends before World War II in this case, and having very different trajectories because of the conflict and things they have to do. So that's kind of a traditional kind of story.
Right. And, you've already mentioned the fact that Max was Jewish, and also he was much more Polish than his friends. And so he has kind of a double whammy when it comes to the way that he's viewed by the Hitler Youth, let's say. But Max and Werner are very close friends. Werner ends up joining the Hitler Youth because he wants to fly. And the only way that he can fly is by becoming a member of the Hitler Youth. But he's someone who sticks up for Max, because there are two or three occasions throughout these three volumes when Max and his family's business, let's say, is attacked by the Hitler Youth. They're smashing glass and even worse, in fact, in the third volume. And it's Werner who comes to Max's rescue. And in the third volume, when this occurs, this is the thing that we can't talk about. There's something that happens that, if we describe, would be a spoiler. But that friendship is still there, right? So even though Werner is a part of the Hitler Youth, and Max gives him grief about that. He says, you joined in order to fly, but still you, in essence, made a deal with the devil. And how could you do that? In fact, there's one point that Werner has a knife that he had gotten from the Nazi party, and Max will not take it in his hand because he doesn't want to be dirtied at all. Now, Hanna ends up becoming a member of the Nazi party as well, but as an adult, we find out fairly early on that she becomes, or if not part of the upper echelon, at least has access to the Nazi upper echelon. In fact, even meeting Hitler at one point. We don't see this on the page, but we get references to this because she is a very good flyer, great pilot, and she becomes Germany's best test pilot.
Yes, so in the dynamic between the three characters, to me, she's the one that was harder to read and understand her motivations. She wants to fly, and she becomes, like you said, this amazing pilot for the Nazis. I'm not sure where her embracing the Nazi regime, where that comes from. It seems that the two boys have a clearer path, and for her, maybe she's more ambitious, but her character was not as easy to read for me when I was reading the book. I don't know how you felt about her, but
well, she in some ways, I think, the way I read her, is kind of an enigma. Although in terms of her relationship with Max and Werner, it's almost like one of these classical stories, right? You have three friends, one of which is a female, and both of the males are attracted to her, even, when they were teenagers. And in fact, there's one point in the third volume when the three of them, again, this flashback to being in the cave, they spend the night there. So as they're going to sleep, one of them, I can't remember if it's Max or Werner, asks Hanna, which one of us do you like better? We know you like both of us. And then the other one chimes in, yeah, we need to know. It's only fair. And her response is to kiss both of them. And so she's someone who's not necessarily torn between Max and Werner, but she seems to have, I guess, similar feelings for both. And in certain ways, there's kind of a twinning going on in that at times I thought that the way that Henriet illustrated Max and then Werner, it's almost as if they were twins or mirror images because they look very similar. And in fact, this comment about twinning and looking very similar really does resonate once you get to the third volume, Werner. And I won't go any further than that, though, because again, no spoilers.
No, but maybe not what you expect.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And
oh no, go ahead.
So, and the other thing, maybe we should mention to people who are going to read this series, which I think it's a very entertaining tale. And if you like aviation and World War II stories, I think this it's a fun read. It's a pretty easy read and definitely a nice time. But then when you get to the end of the third volume, you realize that this is the end of season 1, they called it. Yeah. I thought that this series was only going to be 3 volumes, right? Max, same for me, yeah.
Hanna, and then Werner. But then you get to the end of the third volume, and you're right. It says at the very bottom of the page after the last panel, end of season 1. So I'm curious what season 2 is going to be like and where the story will pick up. And it needs to pick up because it does end on an open-ended or a quite ambiguous or even cliffhanger manner, which is interesting. But, early on in the first volume, we were talking about Max being Jewish. Later on, he, from what we're told, I'll just say, moves to the United States and becomes an American citizen. And then after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he volunteers, he enrolls in the Air Force, he becomes a fighter pilot, and then he is accused of being a Nazi spy because he is very Aryan looking, right? Blonde-haired, blue-eyed. And the military, the U.S. military is is it the OSS?
Yeah.
Yeah, is suspicious of him. And then so they take him into custody and they tell him that the only way they won't execute him as a spy is if he would go on a mission. And as fate would have it, this mission is killing the famous German test pilot, Hanna Reich. Is that her name, Reich?
Yeah.
Yeah. So here you have these childhood friends confronting each other later on. And then as this story unfolds in the second and then into the third volume, well, things happen. Again, I don't want to give stuff away.
But yeah, and it seems to me this, when you read the first 3 books, it is, of course, it's a fiction. They are fictional characters, but they are embedded in the real story of World War II, and there's a lot of references to actual real people, whether they're Nazis or part of the American military, and how they interact with our heroes. So that's also a very common feature of this historical genre of comics, where they insert fictional characters in kind of a real background story. Mm-hmm. Now, I have not read the season 2, which is also made of 3 books that came out in France, and actually the most recent one came out in late 2018, so it's very new. They're called America Bomber Eva and Silber Vogel, the next 3 chapters. But I haven't read them, but just looking at the covers, and I read some comments that were made by French readers, it seems to take a very strange turn that remind me of Man in the High Castle. So I think it goes into
like an alternate history?
Alternate history, yes. I think that's what's happening, which is kind of odd because the first 3 are kind of grounded, and they give you all these historical things and background. So I don't know I don't know to what extent it is alternate, but it looks, especially the cover of the 4th volume is, I mean, it's to grab the reader's attention, but it's quite unusual. I'm not going to spoil it, but you can find it online.
I'm glad that you're mentioning the historical anchors in Bear's Tooth, because that's something I wanted to bring up. I'm wondering if what we see in the first 3 books in this series, Bear's Tooth, Max, Hanna, and then Werner, if it's all historically accurate. And what I mean by that is, okay, I don't know much about, let's say, German aviation history or German history and technology and jet propulsion, but there are some planes or aviation devices, I guess, broadly defined, that seemed quite advanced. Now, I do know that Germany had its own atomic program going on, and, we knew about it, or at least knew some about it, and we were in a race, to get there first before the Germans did. And, of course, I also know about their technology and experiments in terms of jet propulsion, right? We had the V1 and then the V2 rockets, but there are some of these planes and even rocket-like contraptions that seem a little advanced for their time, but maybe I just don't know the history behind this. I mean, like, for instance, the very beginning of the 2nd volume, there are bombers, British bombers, that are, I don't know, it's someplace over Germany, really carpet bombing things. And then the Germans get into these jet propelled rocket ship kind of things and just knock the crap out of the British bombers. Did Germany actually have something like that? And then the kind of planes that Hanna as a test pilot flies are jet propulsive in nature. And so, so I guess what I'm asking is Yann playing a little loose with the history, or am I just not aware of German aviation history?
Well, I don't know if you had at the end of the first volume, the first edition, there is
that's right, that interview.
There's a sketchbook and an interview, and in the interview, he talks about his research, and the way it is laid out seems that it is all accurate. But what he may have done is kind of put a bigger spotlight on one of those prototypes that, maybe they didn't fly as much, or they were not involved in such a big conflicts. I don't know, but it seems to be all based on actual research and He talks about visiting airfields and going to air shows, and I think because of the target audience, plane geeks, he can't play loose with that, or they would not want to read it. If it's completely fantastical. So I think the first three are historically accurate, and maybe what he's doing in the next three is extrapolating on some things that did not happen, maybe could have happened. But yeah, I'm curious now to read them to see where this goes.
Yeah. And I wonder when Cinebook will translate those and release them to English-speaking audiences.
Well, they've been pretty good about keeping track of those series. There are several sci-fi series that they translated, and they had several cycles, and they published everything. So there's no reason why they shouldn't do that for this. And I like what Cinebook is doing. They're bringing really kind of the mainstream Franco-Belgian books to the English market, and those are typically kind of ignored. And it's too bad because, they're fun. They're, they may not be as deep as McCay and some, Riyad Satouf stuff or Satrapi or whatever, but they have their place, and they are good reads. So
exactly, yeah, I had a fun time reading these 3 volumes,
and they're very well done, very in a classic style. It's interesting. So pick them up for Christmas.
That's right, another Christmas present. Or a potential Christmas present, or something for yourself. And of course, do so through our Amazon Associates link at comicsalternative.com/Amazon.
Or the CBS.
So our December show, we looked at 2 titles, quite recent. We started off with Thierry Smolderen and Jean-Philippe Bramanti's McCay, coming out from Titan Comics and its Statics Press imprint. And then after that, we looked at Yann and Alain Henriet's Bear's Tooth, the first 3 volumes, Max, Hanna, and Werner, from Cinebook.
Yes.
So we recommend both of these very highly, and as Pascal mentioned, they'd be great Christmas gifts. So get copies for you and for your loved ones who appreciate European albums.
Definitely.
And if you want to find other great books, some of those that we talked about today, but a whole lot of other books in translation, then you would do well to go to the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and there you will find great discounts, not only on works in translation, but all kind of comics. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can get in touch with us online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you want to reach us by email, I am Pascal at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com, but you can also reach both of us at 2guys at comicsalternative.com. We're all over social media, so you can get in touch with us that way as well. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on Google Podcasts, and on iHeartRadio. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. So this is it, our last show, Euro Comics episode for 2018, but we will be back in January of next year, and we hope that everyone has a very nice holiday season and a happy new year.
Yes. Joyeux Noël, bonne année.
Until then, I'm Derek.
I'm Pascal.
Take care.
And au revoir.